They didn't take him seriously. They dismissed him, treated him like a fool, until he exposed a legal scam right in front of the judge. The courtroom had already made up its mind about him before he even opened his mouth. Michael Grant stepped forward, his suit a little too old, his tie crooked, but his posture firm. He wasn't a lawyer, never claimed to be. He was just a man who wouldn't let his grandmother's house be taken by a heartless corporation that saw people as mere numbers on a balance sheet. Judge Henry Thomas looked over his glasses, the corners of his mouth twitching in something that was almost a smirk, but not quite. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his gavel lightly on the bench. "Mr. Grant, representing yourself?" His voice carried a hint of amusement. Michael met his gaze. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied calmly. A laugh echoed from the other side of the room. Thomas Avery, the opposing lawyer, adjusted his cufflinks slowly, clearly enjoying the moment. A corporate shark, he had a history of bulldozing small defendants. He was here to do what he always did best, win. And Michael, well, he was no challenge. This would be an easy victory. Avery whispered to his assistant, who smiled knowingly. Michael heard it, and he was meant to hear it, but he kept his face neutral. He'd been dismissed before, underestimated. That's why he was here. Judge Thomas sighed and flipped through a file. "This is a property dispute, right?" "A foreclosure challenge," Michael confirmed. "And you think you can take on someone like Mr. Avery?" Michael didn't hesitate. "I don't think, Your Honor, I know." The room went silent. A few quiet laughs came from the corporate side, but there was something else in the air, a strange, unspoken feeling. The kind of silence that happens when someone unexpected refuses to back down. Judge Thomas shook his head, then said, "All right, let's get on with it." But Michael wasn't just here to argue. He was here to win, and they had no idea what was coming. The judge's doubts were just the beginning. The real challenge was coming from the man sitting across the room, the one who thought Michael had already lost. Thomas Avery adjusted his tie with a smirk. This was his domain, the courtroom, the rules, the strategies. He had crushed dozens like Michael Grant before, a man with no law degree, no firm backing, no experience. This wasn't a case to Avery, it was a warm-up. Judge Thomas sighed, rubbing his temple. "Mr. Avery, please proceed with your opening statement." Avery stood, adjusting his jacket as he walked toward the jury. His voice was smooth and confident. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is simple." He gestured toward Michael without even looking at him. "We have a man who refuses to accept reality. The property in question was legally acquired by my client through a foreclosure. The facts are clear, the law is clear. This isn't about feelings. This is about contracts, deadlines, and obligations. My client followed the law. Mr. Grant did not." A well-timed pause, a casual shrug. "I sympathize with him. Losing a home is hard. But pain doesn't change legal responsibility. The numbers don't lie." Avery gave a quick nod to the judge and took his seat, folding his hands as if the case was already decided. Michael remained calm. He had expected this. As he stood, he noticed how Judge Thomas leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a man clearly waiting for something he didn't think would be worth his time. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen," Michael began, his voice steady. "Mr. Avery is right about one thing. The law is clear. But the real question is, does his client actually follow it?" A flicker of irritation crossed Avery's face. "I've spent the last 6 months studying every case, every statute, every loophole used by banks and corporations to steal homes from families," Michael continued, "and I found something." Judge Thomas raised an eyebrow. Michael nodded. "And it changes everything." Avery let out a soft laugh. "Oh, this should be good." Michael ignored him and turned to the judge. "Before I begin, Your Honor, I'd like to request an official discovery, because I have reason to believe the plaintiff is hiding something." The atmosphere shifted. Judge Thomas leaned forward, his expression now more serious. "Hiding what, Mr. Grant?" Michael looked straight at Avery. Fraud. And just like that, the room went silent. No one was laughing anymore. The word fraud hung in the air like a fuse ready to explode. Avery's smirk vanished, and for the first time Judge Thomas gave Michael more than just a passing glance. Fraud? The judge's voice held a trace of disbelief, but there was curiosity too. Yes, Your Honor, Michael said confidently. I believe the foreclosure on my grandmother's home was based on forged documents, and I can prove it if I'm allowed to request full discovery. A sharp breath escaped from Thomas Avery as he shook his head. Your Honor, this is absurd. A baseless accusation meant to delay the inevitable. The property was seized through standard foreclosure procedures. Michael Grant tilted his head. Standard? He took a step forward, his voice calm. Tell me, Mr. Avery, how standard is it for a bank to foreclose on a house when the original mortgage documents have two different signatures from the same person? A rustle went through the courtroom, and murmurs spread across the room. Avery's jaw tightened. What are you talking about? Michael pulled 2 copies of the original mortgage agreement from his folder, walked over to the bailiff, and handed them to the judge. These are 2 copies of the same document, Your Honor, one from the original filing and one from a later modification. If you look at the signatures, you'll notice they don't match. Judge Thomas leaned in, studying the papers. His forehead creased. Michael continued, Now, I'm no expert, but I know my grandmother's signature, and that second one, that's not hers. The judge flipped through the pages, his expression shifting from dismissive to focused. He looked up at Avery. Mr. Avery, do you have an explanation for this? Avery cleared his throat. Your Honor, this is an attempt to confuse the issue. Signatures can change over time. Michael didn't back down. Maybe, but that second signature is on a document filed just 3 months after the original. And if you compare them side by side, he pointed to the papers in the judge's hands, you'll see that not only do they look completely different, but the second one was signed the day after my grandmother was hospitalized for a stroke. A wave of reactions rippled through the courtroom. Even the jury leaned forward. Judge Thomas turned back to Avery, his tone firmer now. Mr. Avery, does your client have the original signed documents on file? Avery hesitated. It was quick, barely noticeable, but Michael saw it, and so did the judge. We would need time to retrieve them, Your Honor. Michael smiled. That's fine. I'll wait. The silence in the room was different now. Not just curiosity, but doubt. But Michael wasn't just here to poke holes in their story. He was here to tear it apart, piece by piece. And this was only the beginning. Judge Thomas sighed, flipping through the documents again, his eyes flicking between the mismatched signatures. His fingers tapped against the bench. The judge, who had once been sure of Michael's incompetence, now looked interested. Avery, on the other hand, was already trying to regain control. Your Honor, these documents don't change the core of the case. The defendant is grasping at straws, hoping to delay the inevitable. The bank followed the legal process, and that's what matters. Michael let the words hang in the air before speaking. Followed the legal process? He let out a small breath, shaking his head. Mr. Avery, do you even know who your client bought this debt from? Avery blinked. What does that have to do with anything? Michael turned to the judge. Your Honor, the mortgage was sold 3 times before it landed with the current lender. 3 separate times. But the transfer paperwork, he paused, pulling another document from his folder. That's where it gets interesting. Judge Thomas took the papers, scanning them, his jaw tightening. Michael continued. Each time the loan changed hands, it should have been accompanied by an endorsement, a formal transfer from one lender to the next. But if you look closely, Avery shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The judge's brows knitted together. There's no signature on the last transfer, Michael said. Exactly, Michael nodded. which means the last company had no legal right to foreclose on my grandmother's home. And the bank that did, they never actually owned the loan in the first place. A hushed murmur spread through the courtroom. The tension in the air thickened. Avery leaned forward, his voice tighter now. Your Honor, this is... Judge Thomas cut him off. This is a problem. Michael took a slow breath. He had them right where he wanted them. They had underestimated him, laughed at him, but now they weren't laughing anymore. Exposing the fraud was one thing. Proving intent was another, and that was where Michael was about to hit them hardest. Avery's face had lost its smugness. The confidence he had shown at the beginning of the trial was cracking, and Michael saw it. The man who had treated this case like a formality was now scrambling for control. Judge Thomas leaned forward, his tone sharp. Mr. Avery, I assume your client has an explanation for why this mortgage was transferred without proper endorsement? Avery hesitated. Your Honor, I would need to confer with my client before making a statement on that. Michael tilted his head. You mean the same client? Avery took a sharp breath and shook his head. Your Honor, that's an outrageous claim. It's just an attempt to delay the inevitable. The property was seized through normal foreclosure procedures. Michael Grant didn't blink. Is it? Because I took the time to research your client's foreclosure history. It turns out my grandmother's house isn't the only one they acquired under these exact circumstances. He handed another document to the judge. Judge Thomas skimmed the papers, his expression darkening. He exhaled slowly, then looked up at Avery. This case doesn't seem as simple as you suggested. Avery's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Michael pressed on. Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness. A witness? Judge Thomas asked. Michael nodded. Yes, the person who notarized the second mortgage signature, the one I believe was forged. A quiet gasp spread through the gallery. This wasn't just about missing paperwork anymore. Michael was about to introduce someone who could unravel the entire case. Avery stood immediately. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This witness wasn't disclosed beforehand. Michael turned to him, his voice steady. That's because I only just tracked her down yesterday. And what she told me... He let the silence hang for a moment. Changes everything. Judge Thomas studied him for a moment before turning to Avery. I'll allow it. Avery stiffened. He could sense this wasn't going in his favor, but Michael's biggest move was still coming. The witness wasn't just any notary. She was the one person who could completely dismantle their case. The door at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and a woman stepped in. Linda Myers, a notary public. She looked nervous as she made her way to the stand, adjusting her glasses and gripping the railing. Judge Thomas nodded toward her. State your full name and occupation for the record. She cleared her throat. Linda Myers, I'm a licensed notary public. Michael stood, his voice calm but firm. Miss Myers, do you remember notarizing the second mortgage modification for my grandmother, Alma Grant? Linda hesitated, glancing at Avery. I do. And were you present when she signed the document? Michael asked. Another pause. Linda shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Avery tensed. Michael gave her space, waiting patiently. Finally, Linda exhaled. No, I wasn't. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Thomas's gaze sharpened, and Michael pressed on. Miss Myers, did you witness anyone else signing on her behalf? Linda swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. No. Michael stepped closer. Then how did the document get notarized? Linda's hand shook slightly. I was given the paperwork by a bank representative. I was told it had already been signed and I just needed to stamp it. Another wave of shock washed over the room. She had just admitted that the signature was notarized without proper verification, making the entire foreclosure process illegal. Avery jumped in from his seat. Objection! This is hearsay. Your Honor, she can't verify the legitimacy of... Judge Thomas held up his hand, cutting him off. Overruled. His tone was now firm, with no patience left. He turned to Linda. Miss Myers, do you understand the legal implications of what you just said? Linda nodded, her eyes glassy. Yes, sir. I didn't know at the time, but I should have. Avery sat back down, running a hand over his face. He knew it was over. Michael turned back to the judge. Your Honor, given this testimony, the forged signature, and the missing mortgage transfer endorsements, I move to have this foreclosure nullified. My grandmother's home was taken through fraudulent means, and the evidence is right in front of you. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Thomas exhaled slowly and tapped his gavel on the bench. When he spoke, his voice was firm. The court rules in favor of the defendant. The foreclosure is void. The property is to be returned immediately. Michael let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The wait, the fight, the months of research, it had all led to this moment. He turned to catch Avery's hollow stare. The man who had once dismissed him as nothing now sat defeated, taken down in front of an entire courtroom. But Michael wasn't thinking about him anymore. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. His grandmother's home would not be stolen, not today, not ever. The lesson here wasn't just about winning a case. It was about standing up even when no one believes you can. Michael stepped outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the steps. He paused, taking a slow breath. The air felt different. Not lighter, not freer, just real. The kind of real that settles in when a fight is finally over. His grandmother's home was safe. That was all that mattered. A few people from the gallery filtered out behind him, their voices hushed, some whispering about the case. People around him were talking, saying things like, never saw it coming, and that man should be a lawyer. But Jared didn't need their validation. He didn't need praise. What he needed was justice. And today, he got it. A voice called from behind him. Callaway. Jared turned to see Judge Thomas Grayson standing at the top of the courthouse steps, hands in his pockets. The arrogance he had shown earlier was gone, replaced with something more thoughtful. You surprised me in there, the judge said. His voice wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. Jared met his gaze. You weren't the only one. Grayson studied him for a moment before giving a small nod. Ever think about law school? Jared let out a soft laugh. Not really. Grayson smirked slightly, just for a second. Might want to reconsider. You've got a talent for making people squirm. And with that, the judge turned and disappeared into the courthouse. Jared exhaled, shaking his head. Law school? Maybe. Maybe not. But one thing was certain. If anyone ever tried to take what was his again, they'd better be ready for a fight. Because power doesn't just belong to the ones with money and titles. It belongs to the ones who refuse to back down. And if this case proved anything, it was this. The underestimated always have the most to prove. And when given the chance, they don't just win, they change everything. If you found this story as gripping as the courtroom did, hit that subscribe button. Because in the real world, the fight for justice doesn't end here.